Money is a very strange idea when you think about it for more than 5 seconds. At some point, human beings agreed that a specific stamped piece of metal, or a rectangle of printed paper, or now an invisible number that exists only on a screen, was worth handing over actual food, actual labor, actual years of somebody's one and only life. And the rest of us were somehow expected to just go along with it without blinking. What makes this even stranger is that for most of our species' existence, nobody used anything like this at all. Small communities got by through memory, reputation, and an unspoken understanding that if you needed something today, you'd return the favor eventually, in whatever form made sense later. So how do we get from here? Take my extra meat, you'll owe me one, to an entire planet organizing itself around pieces of paper and blinking numbers on a screen. There was no single prehistoric genius who invented money. No caveman filed a patent for currency. Instead, money emerged when several much older human behaviors collided. Memory, trust, record-keeping, surplus, and the growing problem of dealing with people you didn't know well enough to simply trust from memory. The coins came later. The real invention was the IOU. Here's the story most of us were taught in school. Once upon a time, humans bartered. You had extra fish, your neighbor had extra grain, so you traded fish for grain directly. Eventually, this got annoying because maybe your neighbor didn't want fish that week, so humanity cleverly invented money to fix the inconvenience. It's a tidy story. It shows up in economics textbooks. Adam Smith told a version of it in 1776. There's just one small problem. Anthropologists have spent close to 2 centuries looking for a society that actually ran on spot barter as its everyday way of getting things done. They have not found one. Not one confirmed example of a normal economy running on direct, one-for-one trades between strangers as its baseline behavior. What they found instead is something far more human and far messier: informal credit. You liked your neighbor's cow, your neighbor said take it, and now you owed him one with absolutely no paperwork and no fixed exchange rate attached. In small communities where everyone knew everyone, debt didn't need a receipt. Your reputation was the receipt. This worked beautifully in a village of 80 people. It falls apart almost immediately once you're trading with someone from 3 valleys over, someone whose face you'll maybe see twice in your life, someone who has absolutely no reason to trust that you're good for it. Memory doesn't scale, and that turned out to be the actual problem money was built to solve. Farming didn't invent money directly. It invented something more dangerous: a reason to keep score. Once people started growing grain, raising animals, and storing surplus in one fixed location instead of carrying everything with them, wealth stopped being something you simply remembered. It became something you had to count. Picture an early temple in Mesopotamia, sometime after 3300 BCE, collecting grain from dozens of farming households. The priests running that temple need to know exactly how much barley came in, whose sheep are who borrowed seed grain last season and hasn't paid it back. That is not a job for human memory anymore, that's a job for a system. And the system people came up with is almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. Small clay shapes: a cone for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a larger one, a disc for a sheep. These tokens, found at sites like Susa dating back to roughly 3300 BCE, functioned as physical counters, essentially a 3-dimensional receipt you could hold in your hand. Owe someone 5 measures of barley. Hand them 5 cone-shaped tokens or seal them together inside a hollow clay envelope as a record of the debt. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Officials eventually started pressing the shapes of those tokens into the outside of the clay envelope before sealing them in, so you could tell what was inside without breaking it open. And then someone realized something obvious in hindsight. If the impression on the outside tells you everything you need to know, you don't actually need the tokens inside anymore. Just the marks. Congratulations. Humanity had just accidentally invented writing, and its very first job on Earth was doing accounting for a grain temple. So the first written language in human history wasn't poetry. It wasn't law. It wasn't a love letter. It was a receipt. Once temples and palaces were tracking debts at this scale, they needed something even more useful than clay counters. A standard unit that let you compare completely different things. How much grain equals 1 sheep? How much silver equals a month of someone's labor? Mesopotamians solved this with weights, the shekel and the mina, originally units used to measure barley, later extended to silver so that value could be compared even when the actual goods being traded had nothing to do with each other. By around 1930 BCE, the laws of Eshnunna were casually stating an official exchange rate: 300 units of barley for 1 shekel of silver. That's not folklore. That's a fixed price written into law thousands of years before anyone had invented a stock market. And once debt could be measured this precisely, it could also spiral this precisely. Historical records from Mesopotamia describe entire households being seized to cover unpaid debts. The problem became common enough that King Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE had to legally cap it. Nobody could be enslaved for more than 3 years over an unpaid debt. Humanity had invented money. and within a few centuries, humanity had also invented needing a law to stop money from destroying people. So why did any of this actually take hold? Why did entire societies agree to organize their lives around debts, weights, and tokens instead of just handling everything the old way, informally, between neighbors who trusted each other? Historians don't fully agree, and it's worth walking through the leading answers honestly, because none of them wins outright. One idea is pure convenience. As trade expanded beyond people who knew each other personally, some standardized unit of value became genuinely useful for comparing completely unrelated goods. That's intuitive, but it doesn't fully explain why the earliest and most detailed money records we have come not from busy marketplaces, but from temples and palaces, institutions with a very specific interest in tracking exactly who owed them what. Which leads to a second idea. Money as a tool of power. If a temple or a palace can define the official unit of value and then demand taxes, tribute, or labor paid in that exact unit, they've created something extremely convenient for themselves. You don't just get people to hand over grain. You get them competing to acquire your specific token, because your specific token is the only thing the tax collector will accept. Suddenly, the ruler's approval isn't just symbolic. It's the only door that opens. And then there's a third idea, quieter than the other two, but maybe the deepest one: trust made portable. In a village, trust lived in relationships and memory. Money let trust travel outside of any single relationship. A stranger who has never met you will still accept your coin, not because they trust you personally, but because they trust the system standing behind that coin. The metal or the paper or eventually the number on a screen was never really the valuable part. It was just the container. The actual invention was a way to carry a promise somewhere your reputation could never follow you. For a long time, that promise still needed a physical object to live inside of. Silver had to be weighed out piece by piece for every single transaction, which was slow and endlessly arguable. Somewhere around the 7th century BCE, in the Kingdom of Lydia in what's now Western Turkey, someone solved this in a way that changed the shape of commerce permanently. King Aliats began stamping lumps of electrum, a natural gold-silver alloy pulled from local riverbeds with an official mark, a roaring lion. That stamp meant something very specific. This exact piece has already been weighed and its value has already been verified by the authority whose symbol you're looking at. You no longer needed your own scale, you just needed to trust the lion. His son Croesus took it further, minting coins in pure gold and pure silver at fixed, reliable weights backed by his own name and reputation. Croesus became so associated with this that his name is still used today, over 2,500 years later, in the phrase, rich as Croesus. Coinage spread rapidly along Greek trade routes almost the moment people encountered it because it solved a problem every single merchant already had. Notice what actually happened here, though. The coin itself wasn't the innovation. Weighed metal had existed for centuries. The innovation was the stamp, a symbol that let total strangers skip the step of personally verifying value because they'd agreed to trust an institution instead of each other. Money had officially stopped being about the object and started being entirely about the promise stamped onto it. And once that shift happened, it never really reversed. Precious metal eventually gave way to paper receipts representing metal sitting in a vault somewhere. Paper receipts eventually gave way to numbers in a ledger representing the paper. Numbers in a ledger eventually gave way to numbers on a screen representing, at this point, mostly just other numbers. At every single step, the physical object mattered less and the shared agreement to believe in it mattered more. We didn't domesticate metal. We domesticated trust, and then we kept looking for lighter and lighter containers to carry it in. So here's what all of this actually adds up to. Money didn't begin as a clever shortcut around the annoyance of barter, because that annoyance mostly never existed in the first place. It began as a memory problem, solved first with clay counters, then with weighed silver, then with a king's stamp on a piece of metal. Each version simply a slightly more portable way of saying, I promise this is real, and you can trust it even though you don't know me. That is the strange part worth sitting with. Every time you tap a card against a machine, or watch a number update on a banking app, you're not really using metal or paper or even data. You're participating in a 5,000-year-old agreement, started by grain accountants in a Mesopotamian temple, refined by a king who stamped his lion onto a piece of river metal, and somehow still being honored today by billions of complete strangers who have never met each other and never will. The coin was never really the invention. The promise underneath it was, and humanity has simply spent the last 5,000 years finding new and stranger ways to make that promise a little easier to carry.